Thank you, everybody. It's nice to be here. It's always great to join these Angelbeat conferences. But let me preface my presentation by saying if your approach to data security is to upload everything to the cloud and rely on your cloud vendor to encrypt and control who has access to files, and you never have what you deem to be sensitive information downloaded to a PC or a Linux box or something like that, or you don't need to control who gets access to files that are on the endpoint when they travel to the cloud or are shared via collaboration tools. You can probably go get a cup of coffee. Cigent's not for you. But if you do have concerns about protecting endpoint data and protecting who has access to that data once it leaves the endpoint, then you might want to suffer through my presentation. At a high level, just to give you our philosophy on security, Cigent believes that with the proliferation of advanced threats such as zero-day attacks, supply chain attacks like SolarWinds, social engineering, etc., putting all your eggs in the prevention basket is really a losing game. It's just a mathematical impossibility that you can defend against all the attack vectors that are out there. There are just too many threats. They're too hard to defend against. And you have very skilled people launching these attacks, and often the people in IT that are trying to prevent them aren't as skilled, don't have the security background that's needed. So the bottom line is a breach is inevitable, and attention needs to be given to defending sensitive data. It's sort of like a circle your wagons approach, right? As a last resort to defending against a breach. And let me kind of provide you with an analogy that I often provide with people. Thinking about a home security analogy, you can put all sorts of security systems in place to prevent somebody from breaking into your home. You can live in a gated community. You can put bars on your windows. But if a skilled, determined criminal does manage to break in, or worse, if they manage to impersonate a trusted friend or family member, which is the case with an attack like SolarWinds or a supply chain attack, you want to make it as difficult as possible for them to steal your valuables, right? You might want to store your valuables in a safe. You might make sure that that safe can only be opened by you. You might even want to make that safe invisible, or at least disappear if you suspect that your security's been breached, or if your SOC or your security provider, hears the alarm go off. They might want to, cause that safe to disappear. And even better, you might want to make it difficult to access the valuables in the safe, even in the case when the safe is open. If you have that safe open and the bad guys break in, ideally you'd want to make it almost impossible for them to even get at your cash or your jewelry, even if the safe is in a state of in an insecure state. And in the case of cybersecurity on the endpoint, sadly, that's just not the case, right? We have a very fragmented approach. I'm going to kind of take you through those use cases. Ron kind of alluded to this, but a little background on Cigent. Our founders have more than 20 years experience in working with the U.S. intelligence and law enforcement agencies. We're experts in the area of data recovery, data destruction, data forensics. In short, we're experts in recovering data from encrypted and damaged media. We understand the inherent limitations of existing approaches to endpoint cybersecurity, particularly software-based protections, antivirus, EDR, other approaches that continue to be easily bypassed by skilled cyber adversaries. The bottom line is software is just too easy to bypass. You can turn it off, you can live boot into a different OS, you can clone a device. There's just too many ways around existing protections. And with the right privileges, in any security layer, including EDR, can be disabled. Encryption keys can be stolen, and encrypted files can be cracked using supercomputers, right? So basically, in response to sort of the state of cyber and the state of data security, we were kind of tasked by the US government to pioneer a unified approach to endpoint data protection that's more difficult to bypass by placing protections as close to the data as possible. What do we mean by that? We mean in the firmware layer of storage devices. It's, as I mentioned before, it's kind of a circle your wagons approach to data security. We're also tasked with solving the problem of stolen credentials by extending a zero trust approach to data security that relies on multi-factor authentication at the file level. And this research was initially funded and incubated within the intelligence agencies in 2018 In-Q-Tel made an investment in Cigent with the goal of having us commercialize and launch these solutions for the rest of the world, basically. So, what are some of the sort of use cases that we're trying to address? Number one are remote attacks. My definition of a remote attack is somebody gets physical access to your device, either like steal it from your CEO's hotel room or your CFO's hotel room. You're going through customs and somebody rips the drive out and clone or tries to clone it. Somebody gets physical access to the device and is able to exfiltrate the data, even though it's encrypted using something like BitLocker or some full disk encryption platform. We also, excuse me, that was the physical attack use case. Remote attacks are instances where somebody gets remote access to your endpoint while the user's logged in through either stolen credentials or some malware or ransomware that's able to access your PC while it's in use. And then finally, how do I protect endpoint data while supporting collaboration? In other words, if I have files that are really sensitive, how do I make sure that only the trusted, authorized users have access to those files when they're shared as an email attachment, for example, or they're synced out to the cloud or putting something like OneDrive or Dropbox? And how do I maintain control over my encryption keys? Do I want to secede control of my encryption to my cloud provider, or do I want to maintain control of that encryption at the file level for these really sensitive files? So let's talk about physical attacks. Given the pedigree of our sister company that did a lot of work in this area, I'm here to tell you that full disk encryption solutions that are currently available are really inherently flawed. It's very easy for a skilled threat actor to reverse engineer or find keys, particularly software-based encryption. You can download utilities from the dark web that allow you to recover keys from files that are protected with something like BitLocker. Similarly, for hardware encrypted devices, a lot of the storage vendors haven't really done a good job in defending the keys. So there are several techniques that can be used to recover hardware encryption keys, including things like firmware insertions and X-ray technology and stuff like that. And then finally, what threat actors are doing is they're just cloning these devices. They're grabbing the encrypted data, and then they're they're going back later and trying to reverse engineer these encrypted files or trying to steal the keys in that fashion. Another problem with sort of this approach is that the threat actors can just wait, right? Like the problem with full disk encryption is that the data is only protected at rest, but as soon as the user logs in, that data is no longer in a protected state, and it's at that point that somebody that's gotten access to your network or compromised your cloud infrastructure or compromised one of your devices can get escalated privileges and then launch a cyber attack. And we've seen examples of this in the media. I don't know if you're familiar with the attack that happened with CNA Insurance, but I think they paid more than $40 million to recover data from thousands of encrypted devices. This stuff is hard to defend against, and you really want to make sure that your data is protected at all times, not just when it's in a at-rest state. Remote attacks are also a problem, right? One of the biggest issues with remote attacks is once the user logs in to say Windows, right, then all those encryption solutions disappear, and now you need a different approach to data protection. We've all heard about how easy it is to bypass antivirus or EDR. It's also pretty easy for attackers to disable any endpoint security software, by the way, including our own, that is designed to protect against these types of attacks. And you're competing with a pretty sophisticated group of cyber criminals who are experts at sort of waiting for the right opportunity to dwell on the network or on the device, do a lot of reconnaissance, privilege escalation, and then launch a ransomware attack that you just can't recover from, or to steal really valuable information. And then finally, the use case that everybody talks about moving data to the cloud, and I think that's a great thing. makes people more productive. But there's issues when you sync data to the cloud, particularly when you're moving data back and forth between the endpoint. You know, the data will be encrypted in the cloud, but when you sync to a local folder, it's no longer protected. So how do you make sure then when the data is moving back and forth that it's maintained in a protected state? How do you make sure that when your employees upload files to collaboration sites, that the protections remain in place? And how do you control who has access to that really sensitive data when it leaves the endpoint? You know, typically, you know, people have tried to use encryption, file level encryption to do that, but they have to pass passwords around. Passwords are inherently insecure. Employees are really sloppy with it. So it's really hard to really lock down that information and maintain control of your encrypted files once it leaves the endpoint. So what are we trying to do here? We're trying to provide one solution. I like to call it a unified zero trust solution that delivers the most secure endpoint data security against all three of those use cases. So we're going to stop remote data attacks. We're going to prevent physical attacks, and we're going to deliver anywhere protection once the data is in transit. So let's talk about the core capabilities of the company. The first thing we do is we try to make data invisible to cyber criminals or cyber adversaries as much as possible. So whenever possible, we will hook what's called the opal layer of a PC and create invisible hardware encrypted disk partitions that persist even after the user logs in. So you know, we use this TCG opal layer to keep data invisible to threat actors as much as possible, and those disk partitions, we call them secure drives, are only mounted by the user using multi-factor authentication when they need to access the files, right? So if somebody gets access to your system, they're not going to be able to even see that these disk partitions exist. They're not going to be able to get at the data, and unless they have the end user's biometric multi-factor authentication, either a fingerprint or Cisco Duo or facial recognition or a CAC or a PIV card, they're not going to be able to mount these invisible disk partitions. Similarly, if somebody steals the system or rips the drive out of the system, this data remains invisible and is non-bypassable. The second thing we do is we apply zero trust down to the file level. So we admit, right, at some point, the Windows file system needs to be aware that these files exist and the user needs to be able to access these files. So at the point these disk partitions are mounted, these invisible disk partitions, and the user needs to access one of these files, we apply multi-factor authentication and optional encryption at the file level. And what this basically does is it makes sure that only the trusted user can access these files. And that simple sort of approach alone prevents ransomware and data theft as long as those files are under the protection of our Cigent software. And then finally, we put a lot of work into making our credentials tamper-proof, right? So for the invisibility, we scramble the keys, we encrypt the keys, we store the keys in the firmware of the local storage device. Almost impossible for threat actors to recover that key material. Similarly, with the software that we use for the multi-factor authentication and zero trust data protection, we take a lot of care into how those keys are stored and make sure that they can be recovered as needed in a secure way. So what do we offer? How does this work? We offer sort of two layers of protection. The first is delivered via a annual software subscription. It's called Cigent Select. It's available on Windows PCs. And it basically relies on multi-factor authentication to protect designated files. It can be delivered in two modes, right? We realize that you don't want to require users to authenticate every time they go to access a file. So we offer a zero trust mode, which is for ultra secure data where you do want to have those zero trust protections in place. But we also have a risk-based mode, risk-based authentication mode, that will only lock down files during an advanced threat or if your SOC is dealing with an incident. maybe, they just become aware of the log4j attack and they just want to lock files down while they're, you know, trying to figure out what's going on or uploading patches, that sort of thing. We also offer with Cigent Select the ability to optionally encrypt files at the file level, so that not only are those files protected if for some reason someone gets physical access to your system or remote access to your system, but when those encrypted files leave your PC, you can add rights management to individual files and specify which users can use multi-factor authentication to open those files. So it's a really nice way for you to enforce who can access files and make sure that only those trusted users can open them by proving their identity, essentially. One other thing that, and I'll get into this in a subsequent slide, is Cigent Select, as I mentioned, also allows you to create these firmware-based secure drives if your PCs support what's called TCG Opal. A lot of you are probably not aware of this, but a lot of the PCs that are shipped from Lenovo and HP, Dell, and some of the other PC manufacturers support this firmware layer, but it's just not widely adopted because it's just very difficult for most companies to figure out how to hook it and use it in everyday use cases. In addition to the Cigent Select software, we have a family of advanced SSDs that have additional advanced firmware features. So we call our first SSD, our Cigent Advanced SSD, and it protects data from physical attacks, it protects against remote attacks, and includes additional firmware security features that I'm going to get into in a subsequent slide, which take the data security protections to an even higher level. And all this is managed by our Cigent Plus enterprise-grade management console, which can be delivered either as an on-prem console or from the cloud. So Cigent Select, what do we do here? We have zero trust data protection that travels with your data. So we support and prevent remote endpoint attacks while the user's logged in with multi-factor authentication and optional encryption. We have a heartbeat so that if somebody tries to disable the Cigent software, all the protected files lock down until the software re-authenticates. We also support remote data protection, as I mentioned before. File level encryption with multi-factor authentication travels with your data, either when it's moved out to the network share or to the cloud, or attached to an email shared with trusted users, etc. And we give the IT visibility and log files for audit and incident response. So if you happen to have one of these Opal drives, it could be an external drive or an internal drive from vendors like Lenovo, Dell, Samsung, Seagate, Western Digital. You're able to take Cigent Select and create these layers of invisibility just with our software. So you're able to create what we call these secure disk partitions. We give you two options. One is an always hidden option where those disk partitions remain hidden below the OS layer, invisible to cyber adversaries until the user mounts them. Another is a dynamic partition that will lock on the fly if Windows is shut down, or if the Cigent security software is disabled, or if your antivirus is disabled, etc. We layer in tamper-proof credentials in the firmware. And when these sort of partitions are mounted, that's when we apply the zero trust file access controls. And we also offer pre-boot authentication for those of you that don't want to use something like BitLocker or some other PBA technique as well. So let's talk about some of the advanced firmware that are supported in the Cigent advanced drives. One is exactly the same as what we support in Opal. It's this concept of invisible data. We also support the firmware-based tamper-proof credentials, the zero trust access controls, but we've added a couple features that are really unique. One is a firmware-based heartbeat that is constantly polling to see that the Cigent security software is protecting files using the multi-factor authentication. And if for some reason that service is disabled or the driver is disabled, then it will trigger a response, and all of those firmware-based disk partitions just lock down and disappear until a connection is reestablished. We also have a new feature called dual mode, which is really interesting. If any of you have policies where your employees have to have a work image and are not allowed to use their PCs for personal use, this is a way that you can create a hidden drive within a system. You can put your work image on this drive and then have a side B for personal use and let your employees, install whatever the software, do their gaming, browse the web, etc. This is also really valuable for traveling employees who are going through customs, staying in a hotel room, subject to some sort of physical attack, as if somebody gets access to the PC, tries to clone the PC, they're not going to see this hidden side A of the drive. In fact, the BIOS isn't even aware it exists. And you can have Windows installed on both sides of side A and side B. You can have Linux on one side and Windows on the other side, or you can just have Windows on side A and just file storage on side B. But the point is you're segmenting your classified information from your everyday data. As I mentioned, we have a enterprise management console, so we allow you to basically push policy, sort of configure and push policy out to users by groups. This includes user and device management. We do threat reporting. We allow you to recover file encryption keys. And we've got some unique features built into this platform that work in conjunction with our secure drives. One is verified data destruction. So if you've ever been in a situation where you need to repurpose an SSD or destroy it, you'll know that that's a very expensive proposition, because most of the secure erase utilities that are delivered by the storage vendors for wiping data from SSDs just flat don't work. They often leave a lot of data on the device due to an issue called wear leveling. So we have firmware-based protections that will go through block by block and allow you to verify that each block has been securely erased in case you want to repurpose this or send it out to be destroyed. Companies, government agencies spend a lot of money just on secure data destruction and secure erase verification. We also support firmware-based unwipeable secure logs. So let's say that you have an employee that goes on a business trip, comes back and suspects that maybe he or she was subject of an attack. Maybe when they came back in their hotel room, their laptop was in a different location, or you go to lunch and you come back and your external drive has been moved. You can basically run a report and tell which files were accessed and when not under the protection of the Cigent security software. And then finally, we allow you to do secure collaboration between groups with this management console. So I can say, I want to add encryption to these files. I only want people in my subscription or in this approved group to be able to access these files at all times. And the only way they can access them is by proving their identity with their second factor of authentication. So just summarize, we're trying to provide one solution that protects against remote attacks, physical data exfiltration, and remote data access. We're relying on comprehensive zero trust multi-factor authentication at all levels, from down into the storage layer all the way up to the cloud. We're trying to protect with low to no operational overhead. This is kind of a deploy, set, and forget type approach. Although, if for some reason your SOC or your partner's SOC is dealing with an incident, they can quickly lock down the data so that only your users can access files and disk partitions with their multi-factor authentication. Threat actors will not be able to get at or to steal or ransom the data. The solution complements and leverages existing endpoint security capabilities. We actually integrate with EDR and antivirus and other security platforms. So we take in that information as a indication of risk and respond accordingly. And this platform is really, really valuable for meeting compliance challenges from CMMC to GDPR to NIST 800-171, HIPAA, et cetera. It allows you to control CUI at the file level and specify, and to control who gets access to that data no matter where it travels. Thank you.